is clear that they're not ready at the moment, or they don't believe they want to take the risks of directly attacking NATO and challenging Article 5. But if they were to achieve some kind of victory in Ukraine, that likelihood would grow. Those forces that are currently tied up fighting the conflict in Ukraine would be free, and the Russians can then focus on modernizing and expanding their armed forces rather than focusing their efforts on reconstitution to throw reinforcements into the war effort in Ukraine, which keeps them tied up there and gives NATO countries time to rearm.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are speaking to William Freer from the Council on Geostrategy to discuss the war in Ukraine, but also Russia's wider European and global posture. William, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, William, your report explores Europe's readiness to repel or perhaps, well, hopefully deter Russian aggression on NATO allies. If Russia is not conclusively defeated in Ukraine or just secures some form of what Putin can call a victory, one of the biggest fears we've heard voiced by leaders in Europe is the idea of a militarized Russia turning its guns to face its other European neighbours. How close to that theory are we now, do you think?
Well, one thing, it's very difficult always to judge the intent of an adversary, particularly in a country like Russia where power is so heavily concentrated in just a handful of people at the top of the political pyramid. So it's very, very difficult to judge intent. You can look at things they've said previously. Prior to their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they outlined what exactly it was they wanted from the security architecture of Europe, which was essentially to unravel NATO's coverage of Eastern Europe and leave those members of the alliance vulnerable to potential future Russian aggression. And yet it is clear that they're not ready at the moment, or they don't believe they want to take the risks of directly attacking NATO and challenging Article 5. But if they were to achieve some kind of victory in Ukraine, that likelihood would grow. Those forces that are currently tied up fighting the conflict in Ukraine would be free, and the Russians can then focus on modernizing and expanding their armed forces rather than focusing their efforts on reconstitution to throw reinforcements into the war effort in Ukraine, which keeps them tied up there and gives NATO countries time to rearm.
And we know that Pokrovsk, that city that's been at the forefront of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for effectively a year now, has been almost entirely, if not now effectively, captured by Russia. What's the significance that you would draw from that city effectively falling, and what should we be watching for next in Russia's invasion in terms of how they fight this war for what could inform us about conflicts in the future?
Pokrovsk is strategically important. It sits at the crossroads of several supply lines and is the sort of forward bastion of a string of fortified towns that Ukraine holds in the area. But I think similar to other cities that have fallen in recent times, Avdiivka and Bakhmut, to name just two that people were very interested in at the time when the Russians were trying to seize them, and took many, many months and tens of thousands of casualties to do so. When they fell, it didn't lead to an unraveling of the Ukrainian front line, and I don't think we'll see something similar with the fall of Pokrovsk. I think what is more important to watch for is the rate of attrition. I think that's going to be a more important deciding factor on the front line in Ukraine. How quickly Allied military supplies can be continually funneled into Ukraine to keep them in the fight, and the rate at which the Russians are suffering casualties and losing equipment, I think, is far more important than the loss of a single town.
And Russia, that campaign has been part of a year-long campaign in Pokrovsk, which is part of the larger, almost 4 years campaign that Russia's been waging to try and capture at least the Donbass. It's taken a long time by most military measurements. How does the modern Russian military fight, and in what way does that represent a threat to Europe, do you think?
So it's a very valid question to ask, given that the Russians have struggled in Ukraine. What kind of threat do they pose to NATO more widely? But I think that despite the fact they've proven that they are not capable of conducting sort of large-scale combined arms offensive warfare in the kind of blitzkrieg that you might have expected to see, and which they attempted early on in the conflict, which didn't go very well, there's still a number of serious threats that they could pose to NATO members. Their ability to build quite rapidly field fortifications
Mm.
and then to defend those very well through a combination of infantry tactics, drone warfare, and sat behind sort of dense and layered missile defenses, which make it very difficult to achieve air superiority to enable a breakthrough, means that were a Russian force able to lodge themselves inside a NATO country, they might be unable to blitzkrieg their way across the Baltics, for example, which is something that previously has been a concern, but they might be able to lodge themselves and prove very, very challenging indeed to remove.
And do we know that there is still, because as you mentioned there's been there's been a long conflict in Ukraine. The success of the Russian military there still probably hasn't been decided. Do we know that there is still that willingness in Russia, perhaps in the Kremlin itself and in Putin's mind, but is that willingness more widely of Russia and the Russian military to engage in further hostility with other neighbours after the war in Ukraine?
I think given the fact that they've been able to take over 1 million casualties, according to sort of most estimates from NATO military officials, to have lost thousands of pieces of military equipment, it will definitely give them pause for thought on starting afresh. But given the way that they've semi-mobilized their economy and their society for armed conflict, it might prove difficult to unwind. And the other side of that is, given that they've suffered these casualties, I think there's no sign so far, either economically, politically, or militarily, that the Russians have decided that they've had enough and want to draw the conflict in Ukraine to an end.
And we've also seen, as part of this conflict, massive aerial bombardments of Ukrainian cities during the Russian invasion. Is Europe prepared and capable to repel those air and also drone attacks if Russia decided to employ those tactics elsewhere?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge for NATO militaries, and integrated air and missile defense, or IMD, and counter uncrewed aerial system defenses, or CUAS, are two of the big gaps that we identified in our report across European NATO. There are a lot of efforts going into increasing those at the moment. The European Sky Shield Initiative, which is German-led. There's Diamond, which is the UK-led effort. So it's a gap that's been recognized. And just to give an example, by the early 2030s, if you trawl through all the sort of published orders to date that different countries have announced for missile defenses, there should be, by the early 2030s, around 160 missile batteries for missile defenses in European NATO military. So a battery is a combination of radar, command and control system, and several launchers. It can vary in the makeup quite a lot, sometimes one launcher, sometimes multiple. It really depends on the system and which country's buying it and how they want it to work. But 160 is essentially a doubling of what is currently available, because half of those 160 are on order and about half are already in service, which is a huge jump. But just to put that into perspective, the Ukrainians have received, it depends how you count, given that some bits have been given in sort of bits and pieces and some have been whole batteries that have been delivered. But roughly the Ukrainians have received around 30 missile batteries, or the equivalent of, from NATO forces, of modern Western equipment to help defend their airspace. And that is roughly a fifth of the total missile defenses that European NATO will have in about a decade's time. But of course, European NATO has about 8 times the landmass to defend that Ukraine has got to defend. So that will be a huge challenge moving forward. And just to put into perspective how large the challenge is, Russia's shown that it's not particularly able to reconstitute lots of tanks and armored fighting vehicles quickly. They've managed to refurbish a lot, but once those stockpiles are run through, which they're not far away from doing so, they've proven a lot less able to build new ones. Whereas they have proven quite able in building lots of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and one-way attack drones. So on average through 2025 so far, they're almost at around 100 cruise missiles, 50 ballistic missiles, and over 4,000 drones every month that the Ukrainian air defenses are having to deal with. And this is something that European militaries would struggle to contend with, particularly over the longer period, given that one of the main concerns, and this is something that we've struggled with in trying to get aid to the Ukrainians, is just how long it takes to build missile interceptors. There's a lot of bottlenecks in the supply chain. Manufacturing capacity is being ramped up, but not quickly enough for demand. And given that it's already struggling to keep up with demand, and European militaries are doubling the number of launches they're going to have over the next decade. It's a real area that needs increased efforts to meet the threat that the Russians could pose. And on the counter-UAS side, a lot of challenges in making it cost-effective. You don't want to be using 100,000, 200,000 pound missiles against a drone that costs 10,000, 20,000 pounds, which is what happened when there was the incursion over Poland. We used pretty expensive air-to-air missiles to intercept those. So counter-UAS is also something that's being looked at, but again, the efforts probably need to be ramped up to fill that capability gap, especially given the challenge of a cheaper system tends to be shorter range, whether it's gun-based or cheaper rocket with precision guided kits added onto them, which have proven quite effective. But the problem is the range of those is quite small. So you either need a platform that's highly mobile, which the Ukrainians have explored with Humvees or sort of turboprop piston engine aircraft to get it to where it needs to be, or you need a lot of them strung out around the entirety of NATO's eastern frontier.
And we did see, as you mentioned there, those attacks into Poland with drones. It's not clear whether any of those drones were actually armed. And there's been much discussion of the very expensive kind of response to that initial drone incursion by Russia. Is it a matter of spending more on these quite large, expensive missile defences, or should there be more going into these smaller, newer technologies like drone interceptors, perhaps slightly cheaper jamming technologies, or does NATO have the kind of space and money and capability to build larger, more expensive systems and use those?
I think there's several elements to this. I think it's important to stress we still need more of the complex and expensive interceptors, especially ballistic missile defenses. There's very few of those in European NATO. The Patriot, which has performed quite well in Ukraine. It's an area that, given the peace dividend in the post-Cold War era and the needs of the war on terror, European NATO countries were not spending much on. So that's still an area that needs improving at the same time as developing alongside those the cheaper, more cost-effective and innovative. We've got directed energy weapons being developed, microwaves, lasers, which can prove very cost-effective, but there's a lot of work that needs to go into fielding those at scale and at the level they need to be. There's been a few sort of interesting developments. So British engineers were able to put together a few older, cheaper air-to-air missiles on sort of the Supercat truck that is built to form what they call the Raven system, which produces a pretty cost-effective air defense against drones. So there's a lot of options available. But unfortunately, we need to do both at the same time. And then to add to that, another gap that exists is what is called SEAD and DEAD, which is suppression of enemy air defenses and destruction of enemy air defenses. And you need to be able to do that in order to push back Russian launch platforms, destroy Russian launch platforms, and also potentially go after their manufacturing base. So, rather than having to deal with thousands of drones, if you were able to get missiles through to blow up Russian drone factories, then that would make life a lot easier. But unfortunately, the SEAD and DEAD capabilities of European NATO are another area which are in need of investment.
And in that Ukraine's sort of retaliatory long-range strike campaign into Russia, we've also seen a lot of strikes and quite a successful campaign on Russian energy export infrastructure. Is there anything in that for Europe to learn from? Because obviously it is perhaps controversial for NATO to be figuring out how to strike non-military targets within Russia. But at the same time, that seems to be the most effective way that Ukraine have come up with, at least, to limit Russia's offensive capability, or at least the funding for those offensive capabilities. Is there anything there that Europe will be looking into?
Well, deep strike for military targets is an area that a lot of European countries are very interested in developing. There's been a lot of orders for long-range, complex strike weapons, which are a very powerful deterrent in themselves. If Russia knows that its high-value military targets are held at risk, then they'd be a lot less likely to risk open conflict in the first place. But more of those systems are needed in the future, and the ability to whittle down Russia's air defenses to ensure that those weapon systems would be able to get through more successfully, working alongside each other. As for the strike campaign on Russian energy, government revenue is absolutely vital to the Russian war effort, and efforts that can be made to reduce that revenue would incredibly useful to reducing Russia's ability to prosecute the war over the longer term. I think so far the Ukrainian campaign has contributed to adding pain to the Russian coffers, but on its own, it's not going to be enough. It's part of a wider campaign of reducing the Kremlin's ability to fund its military efforts, and that sits alongside NATO's efforts in peacetime in the situation we're in at the moment, which is not quite peacetime, not quite wartime, better efforts to force Russian economic pain, essentially. Sanctions have been introduced, but the impact has not been as strong as perhaps desired. There's showing signs of impact. The inflation in Russia is quite high, their deficit is growing, but they've proven quite resilient to bypassing the worst of the sanctions. You look at trade flows between Central Asian countries and European countries for dual-use goods, and they've gone through the roof. And if you look at, in particular, energy exports, from February 2022 to today, European countries have sent about 3 times as much money to Russia for hydrocarbons, despite the sanctions efforts, than they've given to Ukraine in aid.
And presumably in a scenario where Russia increases its levels of aggression directly on European or NATO allies, the sanctions regime would tighten up, would it not? Or is there a concern here that even in a situation where Russia carries out more incursions, more aggression, Europe still relies too heavily on those hydrocarbons to completely cut off Russia and actually deal any sort of significant deterrence economically?
I think there would be even tighter efforts, much tighter efforts, if it did come to open conflict. But it doesn't send a great deterrent signal that in the situation we're currently in, the efforts have not been anywhere near as strong as perhaps Ukraine and its supporters would have liked to have seen. It's a very complicated issue trying to enforce sanctions. I'm not a sanctions expert. You'd have to get lawyers in to give you all the details on quite how challenging it is to ensure that who you're selling to doesn't sell to someone, doesn't sell to someone, doesn't sell to someone. It could be several parties down the line before it ends up in the wrong hands. So it is challenging to properly enforce sanctions, but I think that with a bit more political will from European countries, it can certainly be tightened up. And the other situation which does send quite a strong deterrence to Russia is a lot of the energy exports they do come through their shadow fleet, which uses routes through the Black Sea and through the Baltic Sea mostly to go to and from Russian ports. In the event of an open conflict with NATO, it would be very easy to close off those routes. However, with climate change, the Northern Sea Passage could potentially give Russia an alternative path which weakens our ability to cut off their shipping and drive down government revenues. So that could weaken deterrence over the long run, which is another reason why sort of deep strike weapons add to the deterrence, because even if climate change opens up the Northern Sea route, NATO countries being able to close it off with military means does send a powerful deterrent to Russia in the future.
Well, and I'm interested in the naval element of this as well, because it's not as often focused on in this conflict, which is largely land-based. But obviously, Ukraine has had a lot of success using naval drones in moving back the Black Sea Fleet, seemingly moving it largely out of the conflict, really. As part of this program, I have actually been to see NATO's own research and development programs on Baltic naval and underwater drone defences. Those kind of systems are really at the forefront of any future conflict with Russia, aren't they? Because you would end up there a long time before we're talking about any sort of serious open conflict, aren't they? Is Europe putting enough research and money into those sort of systems, naval and other unmanned systems?
A big concern is Russia's ability to do damage to critical national infrastructure, both in the sub-threshold environment, before sort of open conflict breaks out, but also afterwards. It's an area where a lot of countries are now investing in, and it's great to see a lot of efforts in that direction. The Royal Navy's Atlantic Bastion concept, which just came out of the Strategic Defence Review, will hopefully see a lot of efforts into increasing our domain awareness of the undersea space around the UK. There's a lot of efforts by Baltic countries as well to introduce systems which give them a lot more awareness and ability to detect and track Russian activity in the underwater space, because they could cause a lot of problems. All the gas, energy, internet activity that goes through undersea infrastructure. But I think in terms of more conventional fighting, the Black Sea is not the best lesson to learn from in terms of the way naval conflict might work. A lot of the activity there, Ukraine's success with surface drones to push back the Russian Black Sea fleet, are quite specific both to the environment of the Black Sea and the state that the Russian Black Sea fleet was in. It's less of a challenge for European NATO navies. One of the things that we did see in the post-Cold War era is where European navies, the UK included, invested a bit less in the capabilities they would need for peer conflicts at sea. They did invest in a lot of point defenses for their warships, given the threat from speedboats. They were thinking about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in the Persian Gulf, or pirates elsewhere in the world seas. And that has put them in quite a good space to deal with the threat of uncrewed surface vessels, or USVs. So that's less of a concern. I think far more of a concern for European navies is, because of those decisions they made, they are off the pace when it comes to peer naval conflict. So anti-submarine warfare, surface ships versus surface ships, is a gap that many people probably assume is an area where European NATO is vastly superior to Russia. But the Russians have invested a lot of money in their fleet, the Northern Fleet in particular, which is a pretty direct threat to the UK, as we're one of the first countries in its line of fire if a conflict were to break out. They've invested vast sums in their submarine fleet, and most of their vessels are built with peer conflict in mind. They're brimming with long-range strike missiles, whereas a lot of European navies, there's two sides to this. One is that a lot of their ships are quite old. If you look at European NATO navies, about half of their ships were commissioned before 2010, so only half of them have been commissioned in the last 15 years. And most of the more modern ones have been built with lower intensity missions in mind, anti-piracy, that kind of operation, which means they're not in the best position when it comes to potentially having to fight the Russian Navy. I think that's something we saw in the Red Sea, when a lot of European navies simply didn't have the ships that were capable enough to deal with what is frankly a rebel group from one of the world's poorest countries, and they didn't have the missile systems, the combat management systems, the sensors on their warships that would have enabled them to protect shipping in the region.
And just to finish, William, as we're a tad short on time now, but many European countries, the UK included, argue that there simply isn't really the money, at the moment at least, to spend on rebuilding militaries to effectively Cold War levels. Given where we are now then, are we building this equipment and these capabilities to try to deter Russia, or are we past that point now? Is it more that that at least a portion of this equipment, once it is ready, it will actually need to be used, at least in some form of hybrid warfare with Russia?
I don't think it's too late. It would have always been better to have invested more previously, or even better than that, have not underinvested in the peace dividend era. It's very, very difficult to rebuild or reacquire capabilities once you've let them atrophy to either a low point or given them up entirely. So it would have been better to do it earlier, but the next best time is to start today. And I understand that the fiscal situation facing a lot of governments in Europe is very challenging and very difficult. But during the Cold War, there were also very challenging fiscal situations. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the UK was near bankrupt, and yet we were able to begin not just maintaining our defence spending at a level which was, over the course of the Cold War, averaged about 6% of GDP, despite the fiscal challenges at the time. But there was also a ramping up, a rearmament program in the 1950s, because so much equipment had been let go at the end of the Second World War. So although it is a challenging fiscal situation, ultimately it is a question of priorities, and it is far, far more cost effective to deter a war from breaking out than having to fight one.
Well, William Freer from the Council on Geostrategy, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.